Have you ever wondered why your guitar recordings don't sound like the tones on your favorite records? I struggled for years trying to replicate my favorite album tones until I nailed a method to reverse engineer them. So I'm going to show you step by step the method to EQ matching your favorite pro guitar tones. So we've probably all heard incredible guitar tones and thought to ourselves, why can't I get my guitars to sound like that? And it can be incredibly frustrating. And there are so many small factors that go into making a guitar tone, down to the pickups, the player, the guitar pick, the amp, the speaker, etc. And I've spent hours and hours of my life trying to replicate some of my favorite guitar tones. Sometimes just for fun, sometimes I just do it to set myself a challenge for the evening, or sometimes there's just an aspect or an element of a guitar tone that I like that I want to emulate for my own tones. But also, as you may have seen on my channel in the past year, I've been trying to recreate tones exactly because I've been trying to make demos with my drum plugin to really showcase how close I could get my drum sounds from the plugin to sound like a lot of my favorite record drum sounds. I also needed to make sure all the other elements in the mix were authentic and true to the sound, so I could potentially try and fool people into thinking they were even hearing the original. Now, recreating someone else's guitar tone is not about stealing. It's not about just taking someone else's sound and putting it on your own record. The purpose of doing this for me is to have a better understanding of guitar tones. It really helps train your ears up and really listen into every minute detail in the chain. And I like to compare this to learning guitar or any instrument, where when you're a beginner, you start off by learning other people's music. And when it comes to music production, I think it's a really good practice to try and emulate other people's mixes or tones. When you play other people's music for a long enough time, you learn how to write your own songs. And when you try and replicate other people's sounds, you learn how to create your own sounds. Now, one guitar tone that I really liked when I was younger was The End of Heartache by Killswitch Engage. Now, the album was produced by Adam D, and I think he engineered and tracked the guitars. And then when it came to mixing the record, which was done by Andy Sneap, and I think Adam D flew over, they reamped two of the quad tracks with a 5150. And this guitar tone is just really thick and pleasing. And as someone that spent most of my career playing in E standard tuning, that thickness was something that I really wanted to chase. It's a tone that's very thick and warm with a really dark edge to it that I thought would work well for my guitar tones. And by trying to replicate that guitar tone, I now have a better idea to achieve those results without having to exactly steal the tone or copy it exactly. So with all of that in mind, I'll walk you through the process. Okay, so step one would be doing research. Matching a guitar tone is a lot more than just an EQ curve. First, it starts out with doing as much research as you can on the tone that you like. So back in the day, I used to be a member of the Andy Sneap forum. I'd go on there every day and try and figure out what was used on all my favorite records. Now, luckily for me, my favorite producer and nearly all my favorite guitar tones were mixed by Andy Sneap, so I'd be hearing information directly from the horse's mouth. And if you want to look at what amp or gear was used on a certain album, I'm sure there's tons of forum posts or Reddit posts or YouTube videos where some people have detailed what gear was used on certain records. But nowadays with social media, it's way easier just to message the mix engineer, producer, or the guitarist in the band even, and you may get a response from them. A couple of years ago, I reached out to Eric Peterson from Testament because I always love their guitar tones, and I was asking him what picks he uses and what strings he uses, and he got back to me the next day. But just bear this in mind, reamping guitars in the mixing process has been really common now for at least 20 years. So just because you see a band using a certain amp or cab in the studio when they're recording, if it's then been mixed by someone else, they may have reamped all the guitars with a completely different rig. There are tons of videos of bands in the studio or full making of documentaries where a lot of the times you can see what gear they're using. And as I've said before, the biggest factor in giving a guitar tone its sound is coming from the speaker. So finding out exactly what speaker, what type of speaker was used, what cabinet, and what microphone is going to be some of the most crucial details when figuring out how to replicate a tone. So step two would be dialing in your rig. Now, if you're working in the world of real amps, it may be really hard to get your hands on every single piece of the puzzle, and it could get really expensive if you're especially trying to buy different amps and cabs and pedals and that kind of stuff. But luckily nowadays, tons of different amps, pedals, speakers, cabinets all exist in the plugin world, and it's a lot cheaper and easier to get your hands on similar gear. Now, the best way to get a really good reference for the guitar tone that you're trying to emulate is to find a guitar break on the record where there's either one or two guitars just playing on their own. No drums, no cymbals ringing over it, no vocals, just pure guitar. There are some albums where I've tried to emulate a guitar tone where that has been impossible because there are no breaks where there's just a singular riff played on its own. So when you start dialing in your tone, you want to try and get as close as you can with the source tone to the tone you're matching. It's worth bearing in mind though that in the past 25 years, it's been very common to use a multi-band compressor on the low-end palm mute stuff. So you may need just a little bit more low end in your tone to compensate for this. Same goes for adding a bit more high end, which can either be done in the mix process to a guitar tone, and oftentimes just a tiny bit of high end may get added on the final mastering stage of a mix. But at this point of dialing in the tone, you really want to be listening to micro details like how much gain they've used, how the guitarist picks, how they palm mute, all that kind of stuff. Now, this is a good point to use a frequency analyzer if you can, to visually look at your guitar tone versus the tone that you're trying to emulate. And the main area that I would suggest focusing your attention to is 2K and upwards. Every single guitar speaker is different. They're kind of like snowflakes. So even if you have two speakers off the same assembly line in the same cabinet, the 2K and upwards can be slightly different, but this is where a lot of unique characteristics come into play. So you may want to go through every speaker in your cabinet, or try different speakers in a plugin, or cycle through different impulse responses until the high end that you're looking at looks like or similar to the high end that you're trying to emulate. Now, fortunately, if you're into really modern guitar tones, tons of people are using plugins or impulse responses that you may be able to get your hands on. So emulating these sounds will be much easier. You may have seen a video I did recently about how 4 recent metal releases all use the same impulse response from my impulse response pack. So at this point, if you think you've really dialed in your guitar tone as close as you can get it at the source, now it's time for step 3. So at this point, it's time to record some guitars. Ideally, you want to find a riff that's isolated on a record, and then you want to record yourself playing that riff. Same tuning, try and play in the same way, try and get your palm muting, your picking to sound as close as you can get it. And then you can loop certain sections of a riff and do some A-Bing this way. Now for me, instead of just listening in mono, I find when I hard pan a guitar off to one side and then A-B it, the discrepancies between the two tones becomes a lot more clear. Okay, so at this point we move on to step 4. So now it's time to reach for an EQ matching plugin. Now I tend to do this with a separate plugin that I actually use as the EQ on my guitar bus. When you do an EQ match to a guitar tone, no matter how close you get your source tone to the tone you're trying to match, guitar tones can be so unique that an EQ match is potentially going to throw up a really detailed wavy line to try and get it as close as it can. And there's something about over EQing guitars that can just sound a bit weird or degrade the tone. So I don't personally use an EQ match, even though plugins like FabFilter, ProQ have really great EQ matches in them. I'd rather do this process manually and try and make selective judgment calls to do as little EQing as I can. And if we're working in the plugin world, if we see something like we've got too much 6K in our tone or not enough 6K, this will be a difference in moving mic placement on the impulse response or the cabinet. Now the aim here for me is not to do a side-by-side comparison that sounds indistinguishable, because if you're doing that, you've probably overcooked the EQ. But if you can use an EQ match to show you the characteristics of a tone that you like and where your guitar tone differs, this could be really useful information. The aim is to just get a sound that is as close to that tone as possible, that if you play it to someone without having heard the original for a day or two, you would fool them into thinking it's the same tone, because you've captured and recreated all the same characteristics that make that guitar tone distinct. So now that I've gone through all the steps, let me show you how I've gone about recreating some famous guitar tones for myself. Okay, so this is a demo I made for Ultimate Heavy Drums, trying to replicate the sound of the Black Album. So let's go through the steps. Step 1 is research. There's a ton of information about this tone on the internet, but some of the main points are EMG 81, Mesa Mark IIc++, I think maybe a modded Marshall might be in there, a Marshall 1960 BV cab, a Sennheiser 421 microphone, and a Shure SM57, I think, are the main two microphones. And again, the speaker and the mic placement is one of the most crucial things to get right when it comes to replicating a tone. And obviously there was a ton of outboard gear being used as well, and we can just replicate some of that with EQ plugins. So then step 2 would be trying to replicate the rig. Now, I didn't have any guitars with an EMG 81, but I do use Fishman modern pickups, which are in a similar ballpark. They are an active voice pickup. I don't have access to a Mark IIc++ or a Mark IIc+, or a plugin version, so I reached for a rectifier. I'm using this one from my plugin. Now, it's not the closest sounding amp to the Mark IIc+ or ++, but I do feel like I got pretty close to that sound just using this plugin. And as I said, the most important factor is the speaker and the microphones. So what I do have in here is a Marshall 1960B cab with vintage 30 speakers in it, and we've got the Sennheiser 421 and SM57 microphones here as well, and this is a blend between the two. And then I'm using a Maxon OD808 just to tighten up the front end of the amp. They weren't using this on the Black Album, but I'm just working with what I've got. So step 3 would be find an isolated riff on the record and import it into your DAW. I recorded this from my CD into Cubase, and I've got just the front half of the riff looped here. And I'm able just to look at that tone on a frequency analyzer like FabFilter Pro Q3 and just see what the curve looks like. The main thing I'm noticing just looking at the tone is a big scoop in the 1.5 area and quite a lot of bite coming through around the 4K area. So obviously I've gone about tracking this riff and trying to play it as accurately as possible, and we can go into the amp plugin and just try and dial in the settings. I've just put them all back to a neutral point. Same with the speakers, so I can show you doing this from scratch. I'm going to probably go back and forwards between the amp settings and the mic placement, because going really close to center on these speakers is always going to sound quite harsh and fizzy. So let's just loop that riff and then try and dial in the tone. I'm in modern mode. I don't like a lot of presence on the rectifier. Now it's not thick enough yet, but the mic placement is dead center, so let's just go to the mic placement, just stick to one mic at a time. Now where you see me moving the mic placement on the plugin may not be exactly how it looks in the real world, but let's just have a listen and see about where the best mic placement is. Now this microphone is a lot darker generally, so I'm not too worried about that being a bit darker there. And let's try the 57. So up next, I'm going to pull up an EQ with a decent frequency analyzer. I'm just going to look at the high end and see if we're a bit too bright or too dark in this top end area. Now, that area is quite common to be quite harsh on the Sennheiser 421 microphone. But it does have this similar little dip here that the Black Album tone has. So I think at this point the rig is dialed in well and we can just look at EQing the guitars. Now I can tell we've got way too much mid-range upper mids in that 1.5 area compared to the album tone just by looking at it. So I'm going to start carving out some of those mids. And this spike here. So the high end on the Black Album is really focused in on this area. There's nothing this side of it, none of that sort of like nasally mid-range, and there's not a lot of like really bright fizzy stuff like around 6K. So it's quite a focused area of bite in the tone. And I'm I'm going to do a high pass filter. I'm just going to go to like 60-ish. 66. A low pass filter. I can hear that sort of like kind of cab whistle coming through. So already that's sounding pretty close to me. I haven't done any direct A-Bing, but I'm very familiar with this tone, and I think we're getting pretty close. Now, I don't want to do loads of crazy notching and stuff to try and emulate the exact EQ curve, because a lot of that is just going to be inherent in the speaker sound, and going too detailed with your EQ matching can start to sound a bit weird. And at some point you just have to accept that your tone is not going to be identical, but you just want to take as many of those characteristics as you can and apply them to your tone. So I've opened up this EQ, which is on my master bus, and when I switch between the album tone and my tone, I'm going to hear but also see how the tones differ from each other. So the main things I'm seeing and hearing is my tone is still a bit too sort of nasal and mid-rangey, even though I've carved out a lot of mids, and the Black Album tone is just a bit brighter in the top end here. And there's a little bit of a dip here around like 2.8K, which could just be, you know, coming from the speaker that they used. And I've just got a little bit too much around that kind of 700 to 800 area as well in my tone. And we're going to brighten up this area. Up next, we can do an actual EQ match to see if there are any finer details that we're missing. Now, even though FabFilter Pro Q is amazing and has a great frequency analyzer and EQ match, I don't know why, but I've always just used this plugin. So anytime I'm doing an EQ match, I just keep going back to this plugin. So I'm going to loop a section of the actual album guitar tone. And then a bit of my guitar tone. And that's the reference, going to apply it to that one. Match spectrums, can kind of ignore a lot of this stuff and a lot of the subby stuff because it can kind of get a bit confused. So we're seeing a lot more at 7.7 and then a bit more of that sort of mid-range around 300 to 500 in the Black Album tone, and a lot less of like 12K. We can probably just ignore this. So maybe I could go a little bit more severe with my low pass filter. And I'm just going to use this as a reference and a guide or a map, but I'm not actually going to use this EQ curve on my guitar bus. Now something like this spike here at 7.7, I'm not going to draw that in. I'm not going to add it, or if I was using this as just an EQ match on my guitar bus, I'd be wary of just using it because that's the sort of thing that's probably just inherent in that exact speaker. And I don't know if they'd put a really sharp spike at 7.7 in the mix. It seems unlikely to me, but I don't know for certain. And then I'm going to look at some of these other areas in just a more general manner, but it's showing a bit of a cut here at 1.34. So let's listen to it in context of the mix. Okay, so there you have it. It's pretty close. There's quite a lot of involved EQ on the guitar bus, but it would probably be even more involved and sound a bit weirder if I just went for a basic EQ match. This way, we're using our ears, we're using our eyes just to see what the differences are. I don't care if that seems like cheating. It's a really helpful way to train your ears up. And we've now got a tone that is very similar and in a very similar ballpark to the tone that we're trying to emulate. Up next, I'm just going to really quickly show you this one. So this is a recreation of Machine Head's Burn My Eyes Davidian tone. Skip it on a bit. So at the moment it's sounding pretty close, but we've barely got any EQ on this. This is literally all the EQ. Let's go in from the start, dial in the tone with what we know about this tone. So I'm just going to reset the settings on the amp here. We're going to dial in the tone from scratch. So some of the few things I know about this tone is it was recorded with, I think, an Ibanez guitar with an EMG 81 in it, I think. And it was quad tracked. And I think it was one of the first metal records to use a PV 5150. Definitely one of the most iconic records to use one. And a Marshall 1960 BV cabinet with, I think, 2 SM57 microphones on it. And Colin Richardson did this one. And I think typically he likes the Sennheiser 421 microphone in there. So it could be a 421, but I definitely think I heard that it was 2 57s on this record. I'm going to use the Maxon OD808 pedal, which I always do, just to kind of tighten up the front end of the amp. This is kind of just doing a bit of low and high pass filtering, and it just makes your pick attack a little bit more consistent. Now, one thing I know about Machine Head is they typically use the rhythm channel on a 5150, and Rob has got an amp that he calls Bubba that used to be used on a lot of their records. It got retired from live use and just mainly is used as a studio amp. And they have always used the rhythm channel. And now I've heard rumors that it's been modded, this specific amp of his. I've also heard that it's not modded. And as far as I'm aware, they used that amp on The More Things Change, and the one they used on Burn My Eyes was probably just a stock 5150. But either way, it could have been the rhythm channel, or it could have been the lead channel, but I'm going to lean more towards it being the rhythm channel and just going to go with that for this one. A little bit less nasally mid-range than the lead channel, but they're very similar. The rhythm channel is just a little bit thicker and less kind of snarling. Now, as for the speaker, we've got this Marshall 1960 BV cabinet, and they use 2 57s, I think, on this one. So to try and emulate that, I'm going to use 57s, which is the exact same microphone on either side here, but I'm going either side of the center of the cone to try and blend in two different sounds. So let's stick to one side first. Now, the tone on Burn My Eyes is incredibly bright. I think there's a ton of EQ being boosting the high end on this record, but it also does sound quite fizzy and close to the center of the cone. Let's listen to the other side. blend them 50-50. All right, so that feels pretty authentic to the Machine Head sound to me. I'm just going to copy and paste those settings and paste them onto all the other guitar tracks, all 4 chord tracks. This is how the guitars sound now in the mix with 0 EQ on them. Not quite as bright as the record. Now, unfortunately for me, there's not really any decent spaces of isolated guitar in the song Davidian. I'm sure there are on the rest of the album, but for now I've just got Davidian loaded up, and the only bits I can see guitar on their own is just these tiny little snippets here on the intro. So next we're going to look at the EQ on the frequency analyzer. And we're just going to look at the differences in the tones and try and hear what's going on there. Now, I'm just going to preface this that the tuning is slightly different. I just kept my guitars in standard, I think I recorded this in drop C, and the guitars on the record are in that kind of like Pantera tuning when it's sort of in between regular 440 pitch. The album tone has a bit more low end, it's a little bit more scooped, and there's a lot more high end information up in this top area here. Seeing a big spike around 4.7, 4.6, which could be a Sennheiser 421, or it could just be that specific speaker, and a ton of brightness here. And when we switch back to our tone, not as much. So I'm going to have a play around with the mic placement and the high end coming from the amp to see if I can get my high end to look a little bit more like theirs. Getting a bit of a spike in a similar area there, and let's see if I can boost a bit more of that high end with the presence on the amp. Now, I've seen amp settings from Machine Head, I think this was just from a live show, where they've got the rhythm channel as their main channel and the presence is absolutely cranked, and the presence doesn't seem to do as much, I think particularly when I'm on the rhythm channel, as it is on the lead. I can show you now. No difference, no difference, no difference. And then it really just kicks in around here. So it looks extreme, and it kind of is, but it's also not doing anything, which is exactly how the real amp responds. So I want the plugin to exactly emulate the real amp, so I know that my amp settings will translate to the settings in the plugin. Already pretty scooped, but let's try completely scooped. Okay, so next I'm just going to go back and forwards between the album tone and my tone. Up here we've got the master bus EQ, so this is going to show me what the Machine Head tone looks like, or whatever's being fed into it, and this is purely my tone on the bottom one here. So let's just try adding a high shelf. Maybe not a high shelf, maybe just... So I'm seeing a lot of differences here. If you just pay attention to this area when I switch between the tones. really hear that screeching at me. So this is around 6.2. Next, if we look at the mid-range, particularly this area, we've got a little bit more around this kind of 950 area in our tone. And we've got a bit less low end generally. Okay, so this isn't the most detailed EQ match, but I think it's getting as close as we can with the ingredients we have. That's going to be probably more in line with what they would have done with their rig in the studio and in the mix, as opposed to trying to do some really over-the-top detailed EQ match. So let's just have a listen to what we've got in the context of the rest of the mix. Now that whoomp thing on the palm mutes where I've added some low end here around 70 is gone a bit out of control, so I'm going to turn on my multi-band compressor. Now the thing with this tiny bit of riff that we've been ABing against in the raw state is only really going to help us look at the high end, and we really need a bit of just chugging to really get a feel for the right balance of the low end, the palm mutes, how they feel, and the EQ curve on the bottom end of the amp. But what we can do is just keep using our ears and going back and forwards between our tone and the real mix and try and see if we can make any improvements just by using our ears. But I think we've got our tone in a pretty good place just by dialing it in at the source as accurately as we think we can and just doing some basic EQ moves and not going too crazy on an EQ match to try and draw in something overly complicated that's just going to start to sound a bit weird. Again, a lot of these sounds is just whatever's inherent in that speaker that was used, and if you don't have the same speaker, it's really hard to nail it exactly, but I think we can get really close. Okay, so this is a demo of Psychosocial by Slipknot that I made for Ultimate Heavy Drums. Guitars on this one played by Jamie Slays. This is how the guitars sound with no EQ on them. So luckily for this song, there's a bit of isolated guitar at the start of the song. I'm pretty sure it's played by Mick. He at least played it live in the video that I saw. Can't find exactly what he used in the studio. I think there's talk of a JCM 800 on All Hope Is Gone. Maybe blended in with one of his signature amps. I know he's used like a VHD Pitbull in the past. And I think he may have used a Rivera cabinet on this one. Now luckily there's a Rivera cab in STL Amp Hub. I'm kind of limited here with just what I have to my disposal in plug-in form, and I tried to find, just cycling through all the different cabinets to try and find a top end that looks similar to his, and without even realizing what this cab was based on, this is the closest one I could get to the sort of EQ curve that I could see on his cabinet. So I've got this EQ here on the master bus. There's no EQ moves on it, and we're just going to look at mixed tone. Quite scooped around the 850 area, and then there's this sort of dip and then spike around 6K. The dip here and the spike there. Now this is really hard to emulate exactly without the exact speaker, but I went for a speaker that had similar characteristics and I got fairly close to that kind of EQ curve just by selecting the right speaker. I just used a JCM 800. I've used this Earth Shaker Devices pedal, which I think Mick uses. The tone on the record, definitely on this intro riff, has that kind of squishy, rattly sound that is quite inherent in a JCM 800. So I feel like the tone I've dialed in here, and these are the settings, is pretty authentic to that sound on the record with that same kind of rattle. With mics on the cabinet, I don't know for certain what mics were used. I've got a 57 and a 421, but this is how my tone sounds. So this is the tone from the record. definitely got a bit more going on here in this 4K area, and that sort of spike is there, and that sort of curve isn't too common in a lot of cabs that I tend to use. I'm going to tame some of those harsh frequencies in the top end by doing some notch filtering. If you haven't seen my video on notch filtering, this is a way to get more clarity in your guitar tone, so you can check that video out here. I'm going to kind of emulate this sort of dip that's just in his tone. Now this is probably going to be a bit too aggressive in terms of the EQ that I'm doing, but I'm just going to try and get as close as I can for this one. And then there's a bit of a dip here in the mids on his tone. And do a high pass filter. Okay, so it's getting pretty close. And then on the other side, again, I don't know exactly what Jim used. I've gone for a Maxon, an orange rock reverb. These are the settings with an orange cap. So let's listen to both of them together. And what we can do on the guitar bus is put a multi-band compressor, which is going to just handle some of the woomph chugging that gets a bit out of hand on those palm mutes. Okay, so from this point, I just go back and forwards between the record tone, listening to the guitars in the mix, and in context of the drums, and then switching between the full mix, my full mix, and the band full mix. And the closer you can get with all the other elements, like the drums and the bass, the better position it's going to be for you to try and hear what the guitars are doing and stop you getting quite as confused when so many things are sounding different. It can be kind of hard to latch on specifically to the instrument that you're listening to if the entire mix is off. Hopefully you found this video useful, and this is going to inspire you to try and recreate a lot of your favorite guitar tones. I've done this a lot myself. It's helped level up my listening, my mixing, and I've also done this sort of thing with drums as well, particularly when I was making the drum plugin. And as I said before, this isn't about just directly ripping off someone else's guitar tone. This is about learning what you like about their guitar tone and how you can implement that in your own recordings. It could be that you're making a lot of these common mixing errors that I've outlined in this video, and I'll tell you exactly how to correct them, so check this one out next.